But I guess what I'm asking from a theoretical sense is where, how did this relationship, and maybe I'm looking at it wrong, through an incorrect theoretical frame, but did this relationship become, was it created? Was there was it simply created because people were taken outside of their social lives and went to work? Was there what were the factors that, I guess, disenfranchised? If we're having to point out there's a particular relationship between what we generally, conventionally wisdom think of work versus what we generally think of our life outside of work, where did that gulf come from? What is contributing to that gulf? Or was it there before and we need to see the connectivity? I mean, speak to that relationship.
All right. Okay, so this is something we understand in the book itself, but I understand as a theoretical framework myself, is something specific to capitalism. So in a pre-capitalist society or a feudal society, work and home are connected because most of the work happens within the home. And you don't have to go away from home, sometimes even away from your place of birth to work, and there is such a strict division between work and home. So this division begins with the modern capitalist system where industrial production takes place outside of the home, and the home is kind of drained, if you like, of all productive activity. That does not mean that I'm saying that the work that's done in the home is, not important, quite the reverse. But industrial production or things that count in the formal economy happens outside of the home. So that's where the division starts. And actually, if you think about early industrial capitalism, for instance, the kind of accounts we have of, northern English cities like Manchester or Lancashire, and these sort of, vast factories belching smoke and all the workers who are going to work in it, it is men, women, and children. They are all working together in the factories, and they're working incredibly long hours. So there are these heartbreaking testimonies from mothers talking about their children at work and saying, I don't mind that she gets spanked or beaten by the boss as long as she's not fired or her wages are cut. So in other words, the wages are so little that in order to produce life or in order to survive, the entire family has to be at work. But if the entire family is at work, which is the early phase of capitalism, then the work of life really can't take place, because then there's no one actually to cook the dinner, to clean the dishes, and so on. So there is an incredible rise of mortality, and the conditions of the workers in the early part of capitalism is absolutely miserable. They live in squalor and near-death conditions. So, and that's bad in the long run for the bosses, because if there are no workers, then where is the profit and the work going to come from? So what happens in the early stage of capitalism is actually the capitalist state then intervenes and says, wait, we need to have working hours reduced, and here is the gender part of it, let's save a part of the working force for the homework, while a part of the working force goes to work. And that's where the sort of homemaker, breadwinner kind of division comes from, which actually, because capitalism is such a greedy system, it didn't have in the beginning. So it was kind of a sort of live and learn process for capitalism as well, which created this sort of very strict division between work and home, and was maintained through sort of gendered ideologies that then came into effect, that women cannot do heavy work, women are more prone to, doing embroidery or whatever, as compared to working in the mines. So that's something very clearly that happens from the start of capitalism. And, there is a very clear framework to understand this in Marx, but there are also silences in Karl Marx's work about this process. So, for instance, one of the things that Marx points out is the worker has to go to work because of the processes of dispossession that happened a generation ago. So, in other words, the means to reproduce life, access to land, access to food, was taken away from the worker through, for instance, in England, through the enclosure processes and so on. Then the worker has to go to work and work for a wage in order to be able to produce life, whereas previously in the agricultural feudal system, the worker had access to those means of producing life. That's why life and work could happen in the same sphere. So if those means are taken away, then the worker goes to work. But Marx says that the worker is dispossessed, and all he or she has to sell to the capitalist is her labor power. Now, labor power, Marx says, is not labor, it's the ability to work. And he says, I don't remember the exact words, but he says that just like any other machine, that labor power needs to be replaced, regenerated, etc. But that's where he stops. He doesn't probe the question of what then are the means and ways in which that capacity to work is regenerated. So that kind of silence is where I think social reproduction theory comes in and takes up that question.